In this video, I'll show you how to implement authentication and authorization in Ember.js applications with Ember Simple Auth. We'll go step by step and explore Ember Simple Auth functionality along the way. Throughout the video, we'll be using a small demo application for illustration. It is a simple messaging app with an index route that's just a welcome screen and an inbox route that shows the user's messages. The messages are loaded via an API call. We will add authentication and authorization to the application. Ember Simple Auth is already installed here, but if that wasn't the case, we could just do so via Ember install Ember Simple Auth. In the demo application, the inbox route should really only be accessible when the user is logged in. In order to achieve that, we can use the session service that Ember Simple Auth provides. So let's inject the service first. We can then call the session services require authentication method in the before model method of the route. So let's add before model. As the first argument to that method, we pass the transition that led to this route. And as the second argument, we pass the name of the route that we want the user to be transitioned to in case the session is not authenticated. That would typically be the login route. So let's add that route as well. And for now, we'll simply use a placeholder template here telling the user to log in. So now when we try to access the inbox route, we are transitioned to the login route. We do not have a way to actually log in though. Logging in will typically require interacting with a server that validates the user identity. For this example, we'll use a simple mock server that in exchange for a particular username and password returns an access token, which can then be used to identify the user in subsequent API requests. This is based on Ember CLI's HTTP mocking capabilities, so the mock server is started along with the Ember development server. The server is in the server mocks folder here, and you see that a post request to the API token endpoint with username let me and password in the request body will result in a successful response with a secret token. So let's add a UI for this next. Here we have a simple form with inputs for username and password and a submit button. When there's an error, we show that as well. This template is backed by the login controller. Let's add that controller now. And the code. Here you see we inject the session service again, and we have tracked properties for error, username and password. Whenever the inputs for username and password change, we update the respective value here. The actual logging in happens in the login action that is called when the form is submitted. Let's look at this action in more detail. First of all, we prevent the default handling of the event so that the browser does not actually submit the form and thus reload the page. Then we call the session services authenticate method. That method will, as the name suggests, authenticate the session. The first argument to the method is the authenticator we want to use. All other arguments will be passed to that authenticator. In this case, username and password. If authentication of the session fails, we catch the error, assign it to the tracked property so that the template will be re-rendered. So what is this authenticator we're passing here? While the session service has the authenticate method for authenticating it, the service itself has no knowledge about the details of the authentication process. Those are encapsulated in the authenticators, which are implementations of concrete authentication mechanisms. Separating responsibilities like that allows Ember Simple Auth to support limitless authentication mechanisms via the same session service API. Most of the time you won't have to write your own authenticator, but will be able to use one of the ones that come with Ember Simple Auth. In order to understand what is going on though, it is helpful to write our own for this example. Authenticators are referred to by name. As you have seen, we simply pass authenticator :token to the session services authenticate method here. Like for everything in Ember.js, these names map to files on disk directly. So in order to create the token authenticator, we need to create a file with that same name in the app authenticators directory. So let's do that now. And add some code. Authenticators extend the base authenticator that comes with Ember Simple Auth and have three methods: restore, authenticate, and invalidate. For now, we'll worry about the authenticate method only and ignore the others. The authenticator's authenticate method will be called by the session services authenticate method when the authenticator is passed to that. It receives anything passed to the session services method as its arguments. In this case, the username and password the user entered in the form we saw previously. And as we saw on the mock server, we need to post the username and password to API/token in order to receive the token in response if those credentials are valid. So that's what we do in the authenticate method here. If the response is a success, we return the JSON body that will include the token. And if the response is not a success, we throw an error. Let's look at this in action. When we submit the form with invalid credentials, let's say, we see that the authenticator makes the request to API token, but we receive a 4.1 response because obviously the credentials were invalid. We catch the error that is thrown in the controller, assign it to the track property, and thus the template gets re-rendered. So let's now log in with valid credentials. You see this time the same request is made, but instead of a 4.1 response, we get a successful response with the token in the response body. Since the token is returned from the authenticator's authenticate method, it is automatically stored in Ember Simple Auth's session data. We can use the Ember inspector here to get the session service and then look at the session data here. You see that the session data contains the token here. You'll also recognize that the session remembers the authenticator it is currently authenticated with. We'll see later why that is necessary. When going through the login flow, you can also observe another behavior. Let's refresh here. When trying to access the inbox route without the session being authenticated, you see that we are transitioned to the login route. When we log in there now, we are automatically taken to the inbox route again. What happens there is that Ember Simple Auth automatically retries the transition it intercepted previously when we first tried to access the inbox route without the session being authenticated. That is why these session services require authentication method expects the transition to be passed as its first argument. So now we have authentication working. There's one little glitch in the flow, however. When going to the inbox route, logging in, and then going back, we can still get to the login route even though the session is already authenticated at this point. The login route is a good example for a route that should only be accessible when the session is not authenticated already though. To achieve that, we can call the session services prohibit authentication method in the login route. Let's inject the service. And then we can call the method in the route's before model. The prohibit authentication method is essentially the opposite of the require authentication method. We can use it to redirect to another route in case the session is already authenticated. In most cases, that would be the index route, which we're also using here. So that fixes the problem and prevents people from going back to the login route after having logged in already. Going back here now takes us to the index route. Now there's one more basic step missing, though, which is logout. Let's add a button that allows the user to do just that next. In this example, we have a component that renders the application's top menu. Let's add the logout button to that. We only want the button to be shown when the session is authenticated, of course, and if the user clicks it, the logout action is called. So let's implement that action next. We need the session service again. And in the logout action, we simply call the session services invalidate method. That method will in turn call the invalidate method of the authenticator that the session is currently authenticated with. That method can be used to invalidate the token on the server side or for doing any other kind of cleanup work that might be necessary when the user logs out. In most cases, no such work is necessary though, and we will leave this method empty in this example as well. Now we can log in and out again. After the user logs out, Ember Simple Auth will refresh the entire page and thus reboot the Ember.js application. That is a security feature because refreshing will clear out all in-memory state that would otherwise still be openly accessible even after the user has logged out, like the Ember data store, for example. So now we have the basic login and logout flows working. However, when the user loads the messages, we are not actually checking yet on the server side whether the request comes from a logged in user or which user. So let's add that check now. Here we have an updated server mock for the messages that now checks for a token header to be present with a particular value in order to give access to the data. If that header is not present, it responds with a for1 response, which means the requesting user is not authorized to access that requested data. In a real API, you would of course use the token to identify the user and make sure they only have access to their own messages. We just simplify this here for the example. So now that the server checks for the token to be present, we also need to pass it from the Ember app in order for things to continue to work. As we saw earlier, the token is stored on the session data, and we can get it via the session service. Since we're using Ember data here to load the messages, the right place to inject the header into outgoing requests is the adapter. So let's add that. First of all, we need the service again. And then we can add a computed property for the header. So this property depends on the token from the session data. And if the session is authenticated, we simply send the token in a header with the same name. So here we can continue to load the messages using Ember data's standard mechanisms, while the server side can ensure the requesting user is in fact authorized to access the data. So when we go to the inbox route here again, we see the request to load the messages, and that contains the token header with the token that the server side can use to ensure we are actually authorized to load the data. So now we have authentication working, which is verifying the user's identity and logging them in. And we also have authorization working, which is checking that the user has permission to do something they asked to do, in this case, loading the messages. There is, however, one substantial usability problem here left to fix. And that is when logging in, when reloading the page, we lose all session state and the user is logged out again. Ember Simple Auth does have built-in support for keeping the session data alive across reloads. However, we do need to enable that mechanism, which is called a session store. There are multiple session stores an app can choose from, but the recommended one and most versatile is the cookie-based session store, which, as the name suggests, writes session data into a cookie. That store is also the store that must be used with fastboot enabled applications, since cookies are the only storage mechanism that is synchronized between the client and the server by the browser automatically. In order to configure a session store for the application, we need to create an application.js file in the app session stores folder. And we'll simply use the cookie-based session store that comes with Ember Simple Auth without any further customizations. With the cookie-based session store configured, Ember Simple Auth will now persist the session state in a cookie. As we saw earlier, Ember Simple Auth also stores the authenticator the session is currently authenticated with in the session data. That way, it can use an instance of that same authenticator when restoring a new session from the persisted session data, letting the authenticator intervene in that process. And that is what the authenticator's restore method is for. When Ember Simple Auth restores a session, for example after a refresh, it passes the session data read from the session store into that method. The authenticator can then decide whether the data constitutes a valid session or not. In this case, we will simply check whether the token is present, and if so, return the passed in session data, which will result in an authenticated session to be restored. If the token is not present, we raise an error, which will result in a fresh non-authenticated session to be created. In reality, this method could be used for more advanced things like refreshing a token that is found to have expired, for example. And with this, we are now able to log in, refresh the page, and keep all session data and remain logged in. And this concludes the overview of Ember Simple Auth. There are many ways to customize the library that we haven't looked at, many edge cases that the library will handle for you automatically that we haven't looked at, but more documentation is available in the API docs and guides.